Very good afternoon and welcome to the first in this term series of Brazil in the World seminars. It's great to have people here and with us online for, I think, what will be a very stimulating and timely discussion of an innovative conceptual approach to some of the politics around land and environment in the Amazon. At a crucial moment for the Amazon, if you've been following the news, you'll be very well aware of the record drought of the exceptionally severe fire season and the chronic issues of human rights violations and threats to land and environmental rights defenders. Just over a year out from the hosting by Brazil in the Amazonian city of Belém of COP30, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties. So it could hardly be more timely, and I'm really delighted to have Luke with us. But first, I'll just say a little bit about, because I think we have some new colleagues and students with us today. So my name is Alex Shankland. I'm a fellow in the Power and Popular Politics Research Cluster here at IDS, and I convene the Brazil Initiative, which is one of a series of IDS international initiatives focused on intensifying partnerships with key countries for thinking and action in the Global South. We are very pleased to have some blossoming partnerships, not only in Sao Paulo and Rio and Recife and Montes Claros, but also in the Amazon. And so Evan Killick, who is reader in anthropology and development at our sister institute across the way, School of Global Studies, will be sharing some reflections on the work to be presented by our speaker today from the perspective of a workshop which we were both at in the Amazonian state of Acre in July, and some of the emerging learning coming out of that process. So this is the first in a series. If you would like to stay tuned and attend future events in this series, the best way to do it is to sign up for the Sussex Brazil Group email list. So Kieran will share the email address after Luke's presentation, and our colleague Lucia Nader, who I hope is on Zoom. Is Lucia on Zoom? Give us a wave in the chat if you're on Zoom, Lucia. Has very kindly agreed to coordinate the Sussex Brazil Group for this term. And it's an interesting space because it's not only a good space for sharing upcoming events on campus here at IDS, at Global and elsewhere on the Sussex campus, in London, in Oxford, in other sister institutes around the country, but also for sharing news and views and for self-organized events. And in the past, we've had Latin American and Brazilian student groups organizing events around new tendencies in Latin American feminism, around elections. And so it's an open invitation to any students engaged with and interested in Brazilian and wider Latin American politics and development to self-organize in that space. So we'll share Lucy's email address at the end of the session, and please do get in touch with her if you want to be added to the list. We have seminars coming up later in the term with Laura Treiber-Weisbich, who is director of the Brazil Studies program at Oxford, with Andresa Sousa Santos, who is director of the King's Brazil Institute, King's College London, with Artur from Global Studies, kindly agreeing to be discussant for her presentation. And our own Lydia Cabral and other colleagues from IDS also presenting later in the term. So it's a great lineup. Do stay tuned at this critical moment when Brazil is ending its presidency of the G20 and preparing to assume the presidency of the UNFCCC process, and is a really key fulcral point in the global politics of environment and development. But for today, I think to get us off in fine style, we are really delighted that we have Luke Perry, who is reader in environmental social science at the Lancaster Environment Centre and an Amazonianist of long standing. And we were comparing notes. He's done field work in some seriously remote parts of the Amazon. I was quite jealous because I've also spent some time living on boats and wandering around in remote parts of the rainforest. But Luke, I think, has got a fairly impressive trajectory of field work, engaging with particularly the Brazilian Amazon, but also with Colombia and other parts of the Amazon basin. He has an incredibly in-depth, nuanced understanding of the social dynamics of conservation in Amazonian territories. So we're really delighted to have him with us today. Road testing, I think, with us, some ideas around forest citizenship. Yep. So be prepared to engage in the debate. We're going to ask Luke to speak for about 35 minutes. after which Evan is going to share some reflections, and then we will try and wrap up before 2 with a quick round of questions. And then everyone who'd like to stay on for a smaller group discussion between 2 and 2:30 is very welcome to do so. So, hi. So over to you, Luke. You have your 35 minutes.
Right, right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Alex. Yeah. I think my presentation is going to go on now. Yes, I'm going to be talking about forest citizenship as a way of potentially democratizing conservation. So forest citizenship is not a proposal for a set of new policies in the future. It's a way of potentially understanding what has already been happening in Brazil. And this is an idea very much open for debate, and I would love your thoughts and scrutiny and comments about it. So I'm going to be talking about the Brazilian Amazon, so composed of these 9 states, but I'm principally going to be drawing on fieldwork experiences in Amazonas and Pará. So I'm at Lancaster, but I'd really like to acknowledge the support from colleagues in UFPA, in Belém, particularly the nucleus of Amazonian agricultures. I can't see all of my, is there a way of seeing all of my screen at the top? I've got some kind of blockage going on there. Zoom panel, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, so this talk is a really response to a call for so-called people-centered conservation. So the Kunming Montreal framework in 2022 really proposes a paradigm shift by finally guaranteeing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Great. Okay, it's hard to disagree with that as an intention, but really, I think most of us would agree that conservationists and environmentalists in general really need to draw on decades of social science scholarship about how to seek equitable partnerships. So it's kind of like political ecology 101, really. The first is that, obviously working with forest peoples doesn't necessarily mean that your partnership is equitable. Having a workshop doesn't give you legitimacy to talk on behalf of people as well. So this so-called tyranny of participation. And also that, social science clearly extends beyond measuring someone's material circumstances, and it requires interdisciplinary scholarship to really look at the social and political dimensions of forests and forest communities and territories too. And the third, the final point, as I'm sure you all agree as well, that we shouldn't frame forest people as rational economic actors that are now, tightly responding to cost benefits from RED and other policy interventions. And people's wariness about engaging with conservation and conservation debates is due to complex, often quite murky relationships with state institutions and external institutions as well. So then there's a kind of another aspect to this, which is, well, how can we seek people-centered conservation? How can this be achieved or scrutinized? And I'm going to suggest that citizenship might be one way of doing that. So can citizenship be a way of recognizing the rights of forest peoples? So citizenship is normally thought of as this collection of social, political, and civil rights. Can mean citizenship itself can mean different things. It's your status as a rights-bearing member of a political community, and also the set of relationships with diverse state institutions and institutions beyond the state as well. So that sounds good. It's hard to disagree with the notion of citizenship, but if we look at experiences, including in the UK, but focusing on Brazil for the purpose of this talk, many people along particular social gradients have often had their rights not acknowledged as citizens by the Brazilian state. Their rights have not been upheld. So this has prompted so-called work on so-called differentiated citizenship by Holston, and this also inspired work on differentiated citizenship in the Amazon by Matthews and Schmink quite a while ago now. But Holston describes differentiated citizenship as a regime of legalized privileges and legitimated inequalities. So although Holston's work was based on analysis in Sao Paulo, many of his observations ring very true with Amazonia, both in the past and today. So this is not just, looking at what's happening under Bolsonaro's government, but looking how different Brazilians have been treated by the Brazilian state, if going, many hundreds of years. But the rubber boom is a very good example of that as well, thinking about the Amazon as a place of expropriation of people's labour and care and nature. So there was a really interesting paper published in 2020, relatively early on in the pandemic, And Castro and Brondizio and other colleagues of theirs were arguing that there were loads of really fascinating local solutions to the pandemic, to the effects of lockdown and to the threats posed by the disease itself. So despite, the tragedies and injustices affecting indigenous peoples and others, there were these kind of rays of hope. And they argued that this was about citizenship, really. It was about groups of Amazonians and diverse groupings working together to achieve common goals and demand their rights from the state. So that's the kind of point of departure of the project by myself and colleagues in the UK and Brazil and the US. So we were asking, did forest citizenship, which I'll explain more, help marginalised Amazonians navigate their way through COVID-19? Obviously, the relevance of COVID-19 is fading over time, but I'm going to suggest that forest citizenship might be a way of thinking about recovery from disasters, whether that's the drought that affected Amazonas state very severely last year and then again this year. And it might also be relevant to achieving people-centred conservation. So I'm going to cut to the chase. The definition we're proposing for forest citizenship is the claiming of rights by people who have achieved legal territorial recognition and who attempt to conserve their forests. So I'll explain how we see this as being the kind of outcome of four really important building blocks, both very Brazil specific and from other places too. So this project is a collaboration. It's a TAP, a transatlantic social science and humanities project. Alex is the PI of another one of this portfolio of projects which are running until 2025. So in the UK, we're working with Andresa Sousa Santos at King's College, working with a group of people in Boulder, Colorado. The funding was through FAPESP for the Brazilian counterpart funding. So we've got colleagues in UFSCar, in São Carlos, in UFABC, FGV, and USP. We've also got really, really key partners without which the project would not be happening or certainly wouldn't be legitimate in my eyes. We've got Mauricio Torres and colleagues at the Federal University of Pará. We've got Tiago Jacaúna in UFAM, in Manaus, and we've got Jezin Orellana, who was a very vocal activist during the pandemic and afterwards in Fiocruz. So the rest of my talk is going to be starting with our conceptualization of forest citizenship, moving on to this idea of counting forest citizens. And I think the merit or risks or importance of counting people in itself is obviously something we can debate. I'm going to give you some insights into our ongoing work in trying to understand life as a forest citizen. It's another question of whether people recognise forest citizenship as a concept that's relevant to them. And that's something that we're going to be exploring in the last 6 months of the project. And then I'll pose some major unanswered questions, which we're kind of talking about actively with the colleagues in this collaboration, but it's also something I'd really appreciate your feedback to as well. So the first building block is Brazilian social environmentalism, which is a kind of slightly awkward translation into English. But anyone that's ever worked in the Amazon, you'll see that socioambientalism is something that's really kind of central to modern conservation agendas. So it's this post-1988, under Brazil's new democratic constitution, these joint societal attempts to meet social and environmental goals. And this isn't just kind of, obviously a rosy story about this nice social and environmental agenda. This is really a response to decades of activism in Acre, but in other places as well. And it's partly about social justice discourse incorporating environmentalist agendas, such as, very well exemplified by Chico Mendes and others. So social environmentalism in Brazil is, to some extent, based on legal recognition of territories. So you can provide people with territorial rights, and you can also reduce a lot of the incentives for land grabbing and deforestation, because the land itself is no longer relevant in terms of land speculation and reselling. So there was a mass expansion of these territories under Lula's government. So between 2003 and 2010, these overlapping two terms of Lula's first governments, there were, I think, 29 extractivist reserves, HESEXs as they're known. So this is one image down at the bottom in 2008. This is Lula meeting the protagonists of the HESEX Itushi in the Purus in Amazonas. So we've got Pastor Antonio Vasconcelos, who wasn't a morador. He wasn't an inhabitant of this place himself, which is important. He was a partner as an evangelical, okay? But then we've got Vanderlei, I think her name is, from CNES, who was a local leader of CNES. We've got Keops, who was one of the funcionarios of the Comissão Pastoral da Terra from the Catholic Church. We've got Leo from ICMEBIL. I think it was just changing its name from IBAMA to ICMEBIL at the time. So we've really got quite a collective of institutions who are working with residents' associations to get federal protection and recognition for people's territorial rights. So there's absolutely loads of research looking at how these kinds of territories are effective in preventing deforestation and forest degradation. In general, they're very, very effective. There's been much less research into the social dimensions of these territories. I think it's important for us to recognise now that we know enough about these territories to know that they probably did fail their radical potential. There are many ways in which these territories, whether it's HESEX Unini, does become somewhat technocratic. So the idea of mass participation in this environmental decision-making, many ways can get kind of bogged down in bureaucracy, and there's quite a significant role of ICMEBIL acting as a gatekeeper for people's access to their rights as well. The second building block is Florestania. This, how do you say the word in English? Neologism. Yeah, of forest and citizenship. So this was formalised by Acre's series of forest governments, which was a series of state governments in particular, but with a big presence in the capital, Rio Branco, over a 19-year period from 1999 onwards. And it started through these alliances of rubber tappers, indigenous peoples, environmentalists, political parties, and human rights activists. And this has been a lot of Alex's research in the Amazon. Was it ever properly conceptualized? Probably not. That Marianne Schmink in Florida did some work in that regard, but it was really very focused on livelihoods and market-oriented strategies for making forest resources work for people, to give them kind of dignity and a reasonable quality of life. But writing on this as a form of ecological citizenship, Latter and Whitman emphasised that, in their mind, Florestania did foster a political belonging to the forest and a place-based collectivity. It didn't last forever. Florestania is basically gone. One of its protagonists, Jorge Viana, started talking about sustainable agro in 2023 during the election campaigns. So I think that the political compass has really shifted quite significantly in Acre. We also don't, in terms of our kind of collective thought exercise, we're not totally on board with the vision of Florestania, which really saw forest people as partners where you have very much joint goals and agreement. You know, we see forest dwellers as potential sources of resistance, including to Lula's government and to forest policies, sources of critique and opposition to misgovernance at local scales and state scales too. So I think this is important from a conservation perspective as well, because conservationists talk a lot about conservation allies, where there's this assumption that you can basically decide on your shared goals and then continue very much in tandem with few disagreements on the way. The third building block is looking more broadly at Latin American scholarship on ecological citizenship, whereas eloquently put by Latter and Whitman, the politics of nature is often interwoven with struggles for recognition and inclusion. This is dramatically different to the notion of the ecological citizen pioneered by Dobson in the global north. So this graphic here on the top right shows you, it's very recent, from an ongoing project in the UK, where ecological citizenship is really thought about in terms of us accepting our environmental duties and responsibilities, to be ethical consumers, to use sustainable forms of transport, etc., etc. In the global south, there's a much stronger focus on people's rights. So, for example, thinking about road construction in Peru in terms of ecological citizenship would be thinking about the way that the rights of indigenous peoples have been respected and upheld or not, rather than thinking about the responsibilities of those communities that have been affected. So Eduardo Gudinas has written extensively about ecological citizenship in Latin America, arguing that it can promote instruments for ensuring participation, information access, and social control over natural resources. So I think that forest citizenship, as we are understanding it, would fit quite well with that sentiment. The fourth building block is Eurocentric political philosophy. So it draws on some, quite well-established but aging scholarship by Hannah Arendt that says that human rights can only really be guaranteed through citizenship. So citizenship gives people the right to have rights. We're kind of adapting this into a two-stage conceptualization. The first is we're seeing territorial recognition from the state in Brazil as really giving forest dwellers the right to have rights. And this territorial recognition is not, a well-meaning federal government walking around and distributing these territories. It's years and years, sometimes decades of collective struggle by forest dwellers themselves and other institutions. So once communities or groups of communities have territorial recognition, they're then able, in this kind of optimistic understanding, to claim constitutional rights through their everyday practices of citizenship. And of course, Brazilians should be able to do this already under the constitution, but as I was describing, the historical situation for many Brazilians has been one of differentiated citizenship. So formal rights are important, they must be actionable. And one of the ways this happens is through auto-demarcation, for example. So indigenous communities or others marking out their own territory and then using that as a platform for being seen, making themselves visible to the Brazilian state and pursuing legal recognition. Now we're going to move on to counting forest citizens. Again, we're saying that potentially forest citizenship is already happening. So we're interested in knowing, well, how many people might already be part of this process or have participated. So one example would be the extractivist reserve, a federal reserve in Pará, the Rio Iriri, not too far from Altamira. It was created in 2006 in response to illegal logging and land conflicts in Terra do Meio. And we can see quite interesting, this was a report kind of celebrating 10 years of this HESEX. And some of the interviewees for this report gave some quite telling insights. So for us extractivists, the creation of the HESEX guarantees our right to live in this place and to use its natural resources in a sustainable manner. In addition, This is about strengthening our sense of belonging and strengthening also the way that public policies and our access to public services by inference is able to arrive with us more effectively. The head of the vice president of the Residents Association also emphasises that this was years of struggle. So we can see that it's not just about getting status as forest citizenships, but the struggles that precede it and the struggles that proceed it, that follow it too. So we're counting forest citizens using a territorial approach. We're essentially trying to say in which kinds of territories do we think forest citizenship might have been fostered and how many people live in those territories. So we essentially had two preconditions for these territories. One was, is there a bottom-up mobilisation to create them, at least generally speaking, and is there a sense or reasonable amount of participatory governance? And obviously this is a generalisation. There'll be some examples of extractivist reserves, PIEs, so an INCRA category of agricultural ecological development project. There'll be some examples like Lago Grande, where there's been a lot of bottom-up mobilisation, and there might be more recent creations of these territories where it's a bit murky, it's a bit unclear what is happening or not. But nonetheless, we worked closely with Mauricio Torres, who is an academic in Belém and also a legal activist very focused on land rights. And we decided that the preconditions were found in the federal extractivist reserves, but there are state versions of it as well. The normally state-specific, for example, in Amazonas Sustainable Development Reserve, the RDS. It's actually three categories of INCRA ecological settlement, which is assentamentos ambientalmente diferenciado, quilombos, so it's for the Afro-descendants of enslaved people that resisted slavery, and indigenous lands as well. We obviously had to make some decisions, which is open debate whether we should maintain these decisions or not, which territorial categories to exclude. So florestas, for example, you can go to Tefé, you can buy a bag, Flona Tefé, you can buy some farinha, you can see these real manifestations of sustainable forest livelihoods, which are very similar to what's happening in a HESEX or an RDS as well. Equally, you can go to Jaú, a national park on the Rio Negro. There are Ribeirinhos living kind of very traditional lifestyles, engaging in ecotourism, etc. But from an institutional point of view, they're merely tolerated. There's a conditional acceptance of these traditional populations, whereas the reserve itself or territory is really serving a different strategic purpose. So rather than acknowledging the inherent dignity and worth of the people that live there, so we've excluded those categories. You're probably not too interested in the details of this demographic method. There are lots of gridded population sources of data covering the whole world now. We validated 5 different methods. We settled on World Pop, which is all based on census data, but they use different forms of spatial modelling to redistribute populations along rivers, for example, and to calculate or estimate population change over time. So it draws on Brazilian census data, but it does other things with it too. Essentially, we found World Pop, which is based in Southampton University, the most reliable and accurate form. We were able to validate that also with these 2022 estimates from IBGE, but that's very specific to the population of indigenous lands. So we estimate that in 2020, there were 1.1 million forest citizens in the Brazilian Amazon. I think perhaps more astonishingly is that this population is living in 1,411 territories, which were created in the most part through bottom-up mobilisation. So that in itself is like a massive democratic achievement. It's hugely significant from an environmental point of view. They're covering 31% of the legal Amazon. I don't know the exact statistic, but that would be much more than a 31% of the forest as well. So they really are forest guardians, as is often discussed. The most populous grouping you can see there is indigenous people inhabiting indigenous lands. We've got a very large population of people inhabiting ecological settlement projects, mainly in Pará. And as I'll say later, this is quite an under-researched category. So I've got more questions than answers really about how democratic processes, for example, work in these categories. These shown here in the yellow are other forms of conservation unit. So that will be florestas, national parks, etc. You'll see that the Colombo territories are not very well distributed. You've got some in the Calha Norte in Pará. If you've got good eyesight, you might notice there's one large one in Amazonas, which is in Jaú, which after years and years and years of struggle to actually remove themselves from the Parque Nacional and create a Quilombola territory. So how significant is 1.1 million people? There are approximately 9 million rural people in the Brazilian Amazon. So forest citizens are 12% of this population. They're not equally distributed across. So of the 772 municipalities in the legal Amazon, 317 have 0 forest citizens. So there are many places, for example, in many areas of Mato Grosso or Maranhão or Tocantins, where there are none of these territories at all. There are some places where the vast majority of the rural population live in these forest citizen territories, such as Marechal Tamotugo in Acre over here, and in São Gabriel de Cachoeira, which is very well known for the large and diverse indigenous populations. So moving on to life as a forest citizen. So we're interested in more than just democratic decision-making. So Andresa's former colleague in Oxford, Simokai Chigudu, he did this really interesting analysis of a cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. And he was arguing that citizenship has to be about more than social and political rights. It needs to lead to substantive improvements in people's lives through substantive improvements in people's access to quality public services, which personally I think is a really powerful message, and I think it's a legitimate ambition for forest citizenship too. So one of the things we did when we were thinking through which territories to include or exclude is read dozens and dozens of management plans, do lots of field work, and talk to lots of people. So it's clear, I'm sure you could add to this list as well, that the struggles of forest dwellers does not end when you receive territorial recognition. There are ongoing struggles and challenges, such as maintaining your own political organisation, your residents' associations, how communities are represented, and how groups of communities resolve disputes and conflicts, including conflicts with other institutions, such as federal ones like ICMEBio. Access to basic services. There have been 100,000 rural schools closed in Brazil this century. Thousands of them have been in the Amazon. This is something I'm doing research on at the moment. Communities have to resist the tendency of the state to nucleate. I'm not sure if that's a word in English, but to basically convince communities that you don't need this little school anymore on your doorstep. We're going to put you in a big school, in a kind of mother school upriver, and we'll give you transport. And that is like the Educação do Campo movement in Brazil, the countryside education. One of their central aims is keeping rural education in situ and being taught by people from your community as a form of, essentially, on the road to liberation from oppression. Access to healthcare is very precarious. So you can see nice photos of these floating health posts, the UBS Fluvial. It works when there is a doctor and medical team in front of you, but communities have to lobby to get visits from those communities, those teams, and they have to lobby to get them to come back in a reasonable time frame. Accessing governmental welfare programs, whether it's proving that you've been a rural worker, for example, they're very bureaucratic. Alex's work has shown that many people don't speak the language of bureaucracy, and you need sometimes representation and advocacy in the urban centres to help you access your basic rights. A fair access to market. I'm not going to go into loads of detail, but it's very complicated. So forest livelihoods, you might have Brazil nuts on the tree, but do you have Brazil nuts during a drought year? Do you have access to a market where you can get a fair amount? Do you have access to credit to support you whilst you're harvesting the Brazil nuts, etc.? Communities have massive responsibilities to conserve their forests and biodiversity. So, for example, if you have lake management of pirarucu, this very enormous freshwater fish, communities have to work collectively to keep out external predatory fishers all year round. So they have to be away from their family, be fed, and somehow support the community in their absence. And coping with not just major droughts in isolation, but how this intersects with violence, for example, as well. So I was in a boat doing field work last year, and there were navigation issues for people arriving in town. So there was one community that we passed, community people, whose boat propeller had broken due to the low river levels. They were not just worried about that. But they were also concerned about what happens if the pirates, you kind of saw them as sitting ducks. So this intersection of violence from pirates plus the drought happening at the same time. And also ongoing friction about identity-based rights. So is everyone in a sustainable development reserve happy in being in a development reserve, or would they like to self-recognise as indigenous and create an indigenous land? And these are very protracted, complex negotiations which happen over many, many years. We're doing qualitative research into practices of forest citizenship, mainly in two Hezexes and surrounding communities, in Pará and Iriri, which I mentioned already, and the Unini, which is in Amazonas on the Rio Negro. So this is led by Rodrigo Martins and Jessica Pires, and I'm not going to say much more about that. We've been doing urban-specific fieldwork led by Gabriel Lota into so-called bureaucracy, street-level bureaucracy, seeing how do the bureaucrats themselves understand people's right to health. And essentially, the short answer is they don't. That healthcare is not seen as a right of all Brazilians in Altamira. It's something which NGOs are intervening and advocating for communities on their behalf. That isn't really our vision of what forest citizenship and empowered communities should look like. If you're dependent on an American health NGO, which is itself an environmental NGO with a health arm called Health in Harmony. We've been doing quantitative research across the whole Brazilian Amazon to try and understand whether the amount of forest citizens living in a particular municipality was associated essentially with better health outcomes during the pandemic. So that research is being led by an economist, Thiago Morello. Cutting to the chase, forest citizenship, if it's effective, it should empower communities to hold the government to account, okay? They should be saying, hang on a minute, we have these constitutional rights. Why aren't you helping us control malaria? Why aren't you giving us minimum standards of antenatal care, etc., etc.? What we've found so far, there's no clear evidence of a causal effect of forest citizenship. In other words, so far we have not found any evidence at large scale that forest citizenship, measured in this territorial sense, improved the way that communities were able to navigate through COVID. We did find lots of evidence that forest citizenship is non-random. There are certain places in the Amazon where there's more state and NGO presence. They're relatively remote. So think about places like Tefé on the Solimões, Labria. You've got an office of ICMBio. There were certain places in which struggles for territorial recognition seemed to work more often, more times. We found some evidence that the pandemic was worse for people in indigenous lands and ecological settlement projects in terms of mortality. I've got a few minutes left, just thinking about how to use it.
3 minutes.
Okay. maybe it was a fool's errand to try and quantify a kind of universal benefit of forest citizenship on people's lives, when of course the way that these play out in practice is contextual. Maybe benefits to people's lives are complex, hard to measure, and play out over long timescales. On the other hand, there have been accusations that these kinds of territories serve as poverty traps and really suit an environmentalist agenda rather than anything else. So maybe it is important to have quantitative evidence, just as people search for quantitative evidence into the environmental effectiveness of these territories. It seems that citizenship as a democratic practice can coexist with sustainability, which would seem to be very positive. It's evident that forest citizens are very strongly committed to their territories, including the nature within it, which is also very positive from a conservation point of view. Hopefully, forest citizenship as a discourse can convince conservationists that they need to pay more attention to decision-making structures and not just focus on conservation outcomes. And I also think that forest citizenship helps avoid unhelpful characterizations of Amazonian forest dwellers as this kind of dichotomy. On the one hand, agents of degradation, or on the other hand, docile stewards of nature conservation. I'm going to just leave these unanswered questions here, and perhaps Evan would like to pick up on one or two of them as we go into a discussion. But yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic, Luke. Thanks so much. Incredibly rich and thought-provoking. Yeah, as you can imagine, for me, having worked in Acre very long time ago, and having talked to the architect of the concept of Florestania, Antonio Alves, and I remember the first question I asked him was, "What's it like being an innovator and a theorist aqui onde o Brasil termina, here where Brazil ends?" Because Acre, for those of you who saw the map, is the extreme southwest. It's the very end of the line. It's even in a different time zone from Brasilia and from the rest of the Amazon. And it's exactly. And his response was, "This is not where Brazil ends. This is where Brazil begins." Mm-hmm. And I think what Luke's shown us is that some of the most fertile ground for innovation, for thinking, for emergent approaches which challenge colonial normative orders embedded in a lot of environmental policy have emerged from these very peripheral territories in the Amazon. So I've got loads of notes. We'd love to plunge into some of these, but I think we should hear from Evan, because Evan has just convened a conversation in Acre with indigenous thinkers and young scholars from the Federal University in Acre and elsewhere. So what did Evan's presentation and your reflections on Acre leave you thinking about Luke's presentation? Evan.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm always terrible with microphones. Yes, as Alex said, thank you so much here and so much to think about, which I'm still trying. I think part of my thing is I haven't quite understood how you're using the term. I'm just literally trying to articulate how the way you concluded this with this idea of forest citizens. It's kind of, I thought at the beginning, I thought you were kind of defining it and you were kind of going to do something new with it, but then what it seemed to me was you saying these people exist, mm-hmm. and this is a term that is useful for thinking about how they exist and their relationships with the state, and essentially, and again, so it's your final thing of saying, moving away from that dichotomy between indigenous forest conservationists, guardians of the forest, and ones who are destroying it, saying no, there's this category of people that exists that aren't doing that. They're somewhere in between that. They're making a living in the forest. Yeah, which I think is a really important way of thinking that and reframing that. And yes, okay, so that's the way. That was just literally me trying to articulate how I was then understanding it, because before I was getting at it slightly differently, which was seeing it as a kind of new imposition in some ways, because I think if you're framing it as saying, okay, we're just saying this is what we're doing, and we're trying to coin a term to say what we're doing, that's one thing. I was kind of seeing it as something more, and again, so I guess this becomes the question of saying, this should be a new way that people should be presenting themselves as forest citizens.
Yeah, it's not a manifesto.
Yes, okay. Because I think I was taking it more as a bit of a kind of manifesto.
Yeah.
Whereas you're taking it as an analytical category for thinking about it. Okay. Okay. So that ruins half of my arguments, but but I think there's still arguments that come around. Okay, so now just to go to quickly to talk a little bit about the workshop I organised in Rio Branco in the UFACI, the Federal University in Acre. So that was funded by the British Council, and it was again, one of those British Council initiatives, which sounds great on paper. It was meant to be, there was me and my colleague Daniel Bellick at UFACI organised it. We invited two esteemed mentors, of which Alex was one, two from the UK and two from Brazil. And then it was meant to be 12 early career researchers, 12 from the UK and 12 from Brazil. And it was all, but it had to be in the legal Amazon. And it was meant to be dealing with the issues of the Amazon, all the rest of it, including, the role of forest populations and indigenous people and stuff. There was no money to actually invite indigenous people or local populations. So we, and I still haven't written the final report justifying this, but basically had to kind of play around with funding in order to do that. And again, because the key thing is, as in your work, is that we need to be, as academics as well, everyone needs to be working together and working precisely in partnerships through this. But again, part of the reason I'm saying that, I think when we were there, part of the tension was, and again, this is me as an anthropologist by training and perhaps being overly kind of self-critical of anthropology and social sciences, a few of us from Britain had this worry of, oh, what are we doing? Who are we to be going and doing this? And it should all be indigenous people. What I found really interesting in that situation was that the indigenous people themselves and the Brazilian colleagues, a lot of the Brazilian colleagues, were all like, no, this is a good thing. We should all be here. We should be precisely doing kind of what you're saying is, valorizing the way these people are living and working with them precisely to support the demarcation of their lands and all those different aspects. So again, that was kind of heartening, but I still always, I think, again, my anthropological training, the underlying critique I have of that, which again, you can respond to, is that I still feel that we are being part of these processes of turning these people into citizens in a bad way, basically extending the control of the state, in extending the view of the state. And so again, in using the language of the state, and again, I appreciate you are trying to come at it from the other way, and so maybe it's not entirely valid, but the way I was seeing it was you saying citizenship. Yes, citizenship, they're already all Brazilian citizens of federal state of Brazil. But okay, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but again, what was interesting about the workshop in Brazil and my own idea for a future project is precisely comparing. My more experience has been in Peru, so with indigenous groups in Peru, and it's a different history in Peru, particularly for indigenous forest populations, where they were given land. They could claim land as comunidades nativas, as native communities. And so actually they haven't been fighting for territorial rights in the same way that's happened in Brazil. So they kind of, and also they didn't have FUNAI, they didn't have this kind of position as a lower, as you've said in other writing, it's kind of lower position within the state. So it is a different thing, but ultimately they are still fighting for the same things of kind of proper recognition from the state, of healthcare, of education, all the things you mentioned at the end of, schools disappearing, of healthcare. Well, we can't afford a post, but there's a boat that runs up and down the river. So again, my thing is that all of these groups across the Amazon are essentially always just trying to claim more from the state, their rights as that they should already have as citizens. And so part of my question becomes, first of all, what's new about this that they shouldn't already, they're already making those claims, and and then that comes to the second thing, which is, while you're saying you're trying to avoid the guardians of the forest and all the rest of it, by adding the forest citizenship, I would argue it then becomes a thing of, okay, you get your rights to the state, but only if you're protecting the forest. Like it links it to a sustainability thing, which again, you can argue that people are doing themselves. But one of my key arguments, again, of the indigenous people I work with more in Peru, is that we can't assume that they're guardians of the forest. Their rights as citizens, their rights as people should be separate from their need to protect the forest. Obviously, if they want to protect the forest, that's great, and we want to promote that. But there should be a separation between their rights as citizens. So if there's a cowboy in Acre and he's got his ranch or whatever, like he's still a citizen as much as an indigenous person. So if an indigenous person wants to be a cowboy, they should be allowed to be a cowboy. So my key, a couple of kind of trying to bring it down to a few key points. One is that you still retaining that idea that your rights to citizenship are linked to your acting sustainably. And so again, what I've been writing about recently is the idea of responsibilization. And so basically what you're doing in putting that is you're putting responsibility for protecting the forest onto those people, which again should be a responsibility of the state. Yeah. Yes. So rather than saying, oh, you only get your rights as a citizen if you're protecting the forest, it should be you have all your rights as a citizen to healthcare and education, all the rest of it. And as a state, we're going to help you to be protecting the forest. Yeah, so I think that's a key thing. And then just one final big point is that, again, in trying to bolster rights and all the rest of which I completely agree with, again, in Acre, some of us came up with a thing of, from North America, the North American Native American indigenous peoples, it's a reframing of sovereignty, which actually takes that idea of auto-demarcation, which is saying, it's not that we're saying, oh, this is our land, and that means we should be claiming it from the state. It's something more radical, which is saying, this land was always ours. We're going to auto-demarcate it as ours, as it's always been ours. And we don't care what you say as the state. Yeah. So it's saying, actually, the more radical way is to call into question the very sovereignty of the state, and to have a sovereignty that comes literally from the ground up and doesn't care about the state. And yeah, so that would be a reimagining of that more radical idea of how we might imagine sovereignty. Okay, I've kind of rambled and but a few key ideas.
Fantastic, Evan. Extremely challenging and thought-provoking. But I'm going to ask Luke to hold that thought, because I'd like to actually just to take, if you could, I'm sure you've got some notes.
Go ahead, please.
I'd like to open it up just for a quick round of reflections and questions, and then we're going to come back to you and expect you in 3 minutes to answer those points. So Kieran's got a microphone. If a couple of people would like to ask, yeah, okay, we have one here. Yeah. And please just introduce yourself as well. And I don't know, is the camera on for, are we going to be able to see the audience? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Hi, I'm Dolores. I'm from Global Studies ID. And well, it was very nice to hear your presentation. And okay, my comment is, and it relates a bit to what he said. I was thinking, when you're focusing so much in the citizenship of the region, I was thinking that most of the problems that they are facing, it is not even caused by them. It is caused by, the policies of the rest of the country, like the mining and the agribusiness, and how it has entered the region, and illegal activities. So when we think about the local, the indigenous people and the riverines, I mean, the way that the way they live is already protecting the forest. So that's already inherent to the way of how they live. So I was thinking, when you separate the concept of citizenship to a region, and then not considering the rest of the country, which is also, causing the problems there. Yeah, I was thinking if does it make sense to do that? Shouldn't not only somebody who lives in the north region of the country, but also another person who lives anywhere in the country be aware that this region needs to be protected? And I would even go beyond and think about, people from other countries. I saw Mauricio and I met him last semester because he was here with a group of researchers and a group of indigenous communities to talk to British companies who are buying, gold from, after this, I don't even know if there's any way of mining that is sustainable, but they came to talk to these companies who were advertising as sustainable mining, whatever. And they came to show, to talk about the real problems that they were having on the ground and the lack of water, the contamination of water and everything. So, I mean, yeah, and then that makes me think of, this concept of citizenship, that it's not only about the locals, but about everyone that is actually, that has something to do with what's happening there.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have Artur, and then we'll take one more from the room, and if there are any online, we can then go there. Yeah. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Luke. Thank you so much. I'm Arthur, also Global Studies Anthropology, doing my PhD. And thank you for the talk. I thought it was very interesting, very engaging as well. Thinking about the qualitative level of the research and thinking about the concept of forest citizenship and how the research was based on focusing on different types of forest citizens. How did the concept play out qualitatively on these different levels? I mean, so when the research was investigating, let's say the indigenous communities, how did they identify with the concept of the forest and of citizenship in this way? How did the quilombolas identify with the concept? How do they play out, and how the people on the extractive reserves identify with the concept? And I'm asking this just to understand if the concept ends up being useful for like the everyday life of these people, or if it's something that is only reserved for, let's say, the people that participate on the different associations that do the proper direct relationship with the state, or if this happens on sort of like a day-to-day basis. Let's say a person from an extractive reserve needs to go to the, I don't know, the local cartório or something like that, and needs to claim a certain right. How does that play out? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Artur. Kieran, do we have any online? Okay, great. Wonderful. So you've got responsibilization, sovereignty, national and global dimensions of citizenship, diversity, identification, everyday meanings.
Perfect.
1 minute enough? 2 minutes maybe?
So yeah, thanks very much for those really insightful comments, questions and concerns. So Evan's point initially was about do these territories really serve to just extend the control of the state? And they definitely do. There's an argument that territory makes people and space governable. Yes, it does. I guess it depends what comes in compensation for that greater legibility to the state. I think there is a cynical argument, which I think has some truth to it, that these are really spaces of environmentality where the Brazilian state has managed to get people to change their relationship with themselves and with nature relatively cheaply. I saw that in the Jaú where communities were talking about their literally kin upstream as being traficantes. They weren't talking about them being primos or tios. Eles são os traficantes because there they sell tracajá, the Amazon river turtle, which has always been an important source of income. So I think there definitely are negative aspects to these territories, and it does suit a conservation agenda relatively efficiently. So I agree with that concern, Evan. If these processes of citizenship, which start with the struggle for territorial recognition, if they have led communities to be more empowered and able to hold authorities to account, then personally, I would be optimistic that there were benefits to people's lives. I think it remains unclear if people are able to hold authorities to account in general, or whether they're still dependent on advocates from NGOs, from churches, from friendly arms of the government. So I think for me that's a question mark, and maybe there is no generalizable answer to that concern. Evan asked about he said surely that rights and responsibilities should be separated from each other. That is very much what I tried to emphasize at the beginning, that our focus is rights, but obviously our definition is conditional because it's whilst attempting to conserve your forest. So I think that's a really valid question, though I'd note territories themselves have rules, some of which are externally imposed and some of which are developed through the participatory management plan, whether you are allowed to have cattle, for example. And obviously there are places like Chico Mendes Reserve in Acre, where people have changed their livelihoods and land uses in accordance with diminishing promise from rubber and increased interest in growing, in raising cows. So yeah, I think that's complicated. I don't have an easy answer to that. I'd say that citizenship can be exclusionary. You know, there's this discourse in Brazil about cidadão do bem that Bolsonaro said. So it's like, well, if you're not a good citizen, what are you? And it can legitimize actually an erosion of people's rights rather than citizenship as a positive thing, which should be guaranteeing people's rights. Dolores, you were making the point that most of the problems in the Amazon are from the outside. I agree to an extent. Obviously, it's not that the 25 million Amazonians live in harmony with nature. It's more complex than that. But I think that I do agree that it's really important to look at what this means for rights and responsibilities in other parts of Brazil. You know, is this just another example of perpetuating the dominance of certain kinds of Brazilians and trapping them provocatively into a form of sub-citizenship, where you live in the forest, you get your basic education and occasional visit from health posts, and you look after those resources, and many other Brazilians benefit kind of at your expense. I think that if we were thinking about ecological citizenship in Brazil in general, then I think this northern notion of ethical consumption and you burdening your environmental duties and responsibilities, that is something that I think should happen, let's say in Sao Paulo, that there is a greater consciousness of your rights and how your own lifestyle affects people's lives and nature in the Amazon. Arthur, maybe end there if I'm going to run out of time. But on Arthur's point.
Do you want to? Yeah. Do you want to come to Arthur's point? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I wish I knew the answer to your questions. So, firstly, as you probably saw, we worked in HESEX reserves. We've been talking to Barbara Abrão, a PhD student who's finishing a PhD in Oxford, and she spent a year and a half in a Quilombola community in the Calha Norte in the Amazon. So we've been talking to her about she is interested in like sharing some of her experiences and critiquing some of our discussions in relation to her insights from working with quilombolas, but we won't know how quilombolas might relate to this notion of this label of forest citizen. We haven't asked people either yet. That's something we're planning in the last 6 months of the project for communities that we've been working with more closely. But just as a guess, I would imagine that if there is any like traction in that term, it would be used strategically. So it probably has very little relation to people's day-to-day lives, but maybe there are circumstances in which people could strategically draw on the notion of forest citizenship in making rights claims, which I think would be very positive, really.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So we have Phil, and I'm going to abuse the chair's position and ask a question as well. Is anyone online, Kieran? Nope. Okay. Anyone else in the room beyond Phil? Okay. So let's go to Phil, and then I'll hit you with my questions, and we'll do a final round of reflections before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Phil Mader. I'm a research fellow here at IDS, and unfortunately, I know nothing about Brazil. Also, unfortunately, I've been struggling to really formulate my question, so I apologize for what's coming. I'm still trying to grapple with what your notion of citizenship really suggests here, and how it relates perhaps to subjecthood versus citizenship. All these people are Brazilian subjects already. I know a few things about India, so not that much about tribal people there, but I did a little bit of fieldwork before the pandemic, and one of the senses I came away with from what I was studying there was that, particularly in relation to the currently very important rights framework there called the Forest Rights Act. I don't know if Brazil has anything comparable.
Interesting.
India is home to the largest surviving indigenous population in the world, it's said, and I think there's a lot of levels at which it might be comparable with Brazil. And the Forest Rights Act gives people the right to claim ownership, tenure, and usufruct of what has traditionally, historically been their land. And in my reading, this has led to rights claims of land which are very often not about the idea of becoming fully included Indian citizens. They're rather about becoming owners of one's own land and seeking to escape what often are the worst forms of inclusion, debt bondage, bonded labor, debt slavery, and being expected to subjugate oneself to Hindu religious identities and practices rather than indigenous ones. And thereby, sort of saying, well, as an Indian citizen, I can claim right to land, and then please leave me alone. It's not that pure, of course. There are further rights claims that people then make and so on. But fundamentally, what I was struck with was that that's the trajectory that a lot of the people I studied, or I had the privilege of studying there with, are on. And I don't know how that relates exactly to what you've seen under this or what you're trying to articulate under this very broad category of forest citizenship, of whether it is about trying to become Brazilian citizens fully fledged through the citizenship of the forest, or whether it's about becoming forest citizens first and foremost, and the sort of more mainstream Brazilian citizenship at best being a side effect or something that perhaps isn't desirable for everyone at all. I guess maybe what I'm trying to push for is, can you articulate a little bit more sharply what sort of separate versus inclusionist understanding of citizenship you're trying to encapsulate with this notion?
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. So I'd like to pick up on that theme of separate versus inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have talked a bit before. Actually, before that, I want to share a reflection, because Phil, I think I'm right in saying the Forest Rights Act permits land to be claimed if it is of spiritual significance to Adivasi people, which, as far as I'm aware, is not in the Brazilian legal framework for protected areas, despite the fact that we know, anthropologists know particularly, that relations with non-human entities in a particular territory is quite key to identifying territory. So I was just interested in whether any of your work had picked up on that spiritual dimension about, Mãe d'Água, Yara, other beings that may be associated with particular places in the territory. Because I think there was one case in Odisha, where they claimed the land, Adivasis claimed the land based on its religious significance as opposed to other FRA contingencies, which I think might be an interesting thing for Brazil to learn from. But the unity and difference point relates to, this is me, memory lane, the Forest People's Alliance in the 90s, which originated in our group with Chico Mendes, who Luke spoke about, who was the Rubber Tappers leader, and with a group of indigenous leaders. And these are population groups who had been in armed conflict for a century, since the Rubber Tappers first arrived in the late 19th century in the rubber boom, right? So the fact they came together in a unified struggle to preserve the forest and their territorial rights over it, the indigenous and more recent migrants who identified as forest people, the Rubber Tappers, but had originally migrated a century earlier from the drier lands of northeast Brazil. And that was a phenomenally powerful social movement based on bridging those differences. So it was an inclusionary movement of, and this is where the Florestania idea came from, at least in the 90s, and I think it evolved subsequently in some of the literature that you discussed. But it was controversial, and it was problematized, not least by indigenous rights activists who said, there's a Brazilian phrase, farinha no mesmo saco, don't put all the flour in the same bag, right? These are multiple, diverse, complex, particular identities. So I was going to ask you if in the conversations you're having, and this builds on Artur's question, if you're talking to Quilombola people who are coming out of a racial justice movement, if you're talking to indigenous people who are coming out of a, if you like, a primordial sovereignty perhaps approach in the way that Evan's spoken about, and you're talking to people who are the descendants of migrants from a century or more ago in the rubber boom, is there a unifying collectivity that could be politically mobilized across those differences in the way that there was an attempt to create that in the 1990s? Because that ultimately, flawed and problematic as it was perhaps the greatest movement forward for territorial rights claiming that the Amazon had seen up till then. And in this current moment, where, as you say, there's a lot of land being demarcated by the state, possibly through a kind of governmentality, environmentality logic, and I'll ask a follow-up on that in a minute. But where are we now in terms of Florestania, forest citizenship, as something capable of mobilizing collective action across identities and territories? Is it something that's more in the domain of state policy, academic debate, and some leaders, or is it something that's embedded in the practices of those very grassroots association leaders that you've been working with and so on? And I wanted to relate that, this idea of collective action across difference and bargaining with the state from unity, from a position of unity and diversity, because we are looking at a potentially very significant change in the flows of money to the Amazon, associated particularly with carbon credits, right? And establishing territorial claims is also establishing claims to some of those flows. And to what extent is it going to be everyone for themselves? You know, the indigenous people will be top of the queue because they're in the UN frameworks and they will, you know, they will hang on to as much as they can. Or are we talking about a collective struggle for redistribution so that we get away from this idea of poverty traps into an idea of realizing citizenship by a rightful share, right? To quote Ferguson, right? The politics of the rightful share. You know, there is an environment, there is a global rent, right? Which is the carbon credit, which is currently being captured by financial engineers, philanthro-capitalist NGOs and so on, right? So essentially that rent ought to be redistributed to the peoples of the forest. The question is, are they politically organized to fight that fight? Are they going to be there in Belém with a common platform across these diversities where the carbon cowboys will be there in force? Are we going to see a reconfiguration of forces around this new rush, right? The Amazon saw the rubber rush 150 years ago. Are we going to see a carbon rush now? And if so, how are these diverse identities positioned to engage in that struggle? Any other questions in the room, or can we go back to Luke for a final round of reflections?
So thank you for those easy questions, which I'll try. Phil, thanks very much for your comments and your questions. You asked me if I could articulate more sharply in the beginning. I think I cannot, to be honest. We're a diverse group of academics in the project, and some of my colleagues are political scientists and anthropologists and rural sociologists. I think they could articulate it more sharply, but I am struggling to do that. You talked about the Forest Rights Act in India. I think that sounds really fascinating. I wasn't aware of that. I'd love to speak to you more about that. In this article we've got in review at the moment, forest citizenship elsewhere is a kind of open question. And there is some really interesting work on, comparative work on democracy in the woods and looking at how, you know, comparing India and Tanzania and Mexico, and exploring the lingering effects of colonialism as well, about basically the relationships between rights and land and productivity, and how those things. So, like Mexico, for example, might have more potential for forest citizenship, where there was a stronger emphasis on collective land rights under the Spanish, for example. I think you mentioned escaping the worst parts of inclusion as well. I think there is a big danger in the breadth of this category of forest citizenship, because it's also yet another category that is very much outsiders labelling to particular groups. So I'd say that I'm uneasy about that at the moment, and I think this last 6 months of the project is really when we're joining together the researchers that have been involved in all the qualitative research. I don't want to kind of overextend my own ability to answer that and speculate. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but go ahead.
Microphone.
Various forest citizenship as different forest citizenships or different understandings of forest citizenships. It may not end up being one category.
Okay.
I need to repeat that for the question.
Yeah, so there might be different understandings of forest citizenship. It might not be one category. That is very plausible, even within the relatively small number of sites that we've been doing detailed work in. It might be that even within a community, there are different understandings of this term or the ideas around it. I think Alex asked about spiritual dimensions. I think that is a really interesting question. I literally just do not know the answer yet, because I think that's from the qualitative data. Like Ufskar's, I've got 3 new PhD students that are in the field or just back from the field. So I haven't spoken to them yet, but I plan to. Where are we now for mobilising for collective action? Yeah, because there was this massive downturn in legal recognition of these forest territories. So that obviously is evidence that this isn't just about bottom-up struggles for recognition. It's how receptive the federal government and state governments are to these struggles for recognition as well. We were discussing before this the new territorial category of territorio de uso común, this territory of common usage, which goes beyond the normal identity categories associated with territorial claims. So that does seem to be really important and significant. It's playing out across at least Amazonas state at the moment. But as I was describing to Alex before, there are such severe levels of violence against rural leaders at the moment and against NGOs that some of the recent interactions last month have been cancelled because of that. They were partly around developing the participatory management plans for a TUC in Manincoré in Amazonas state. Alex, you also mentioned at the end about carbon credits and kind of avoiding the risks that these carbon cowboys expropriate the benefits of these new financial flows. I think it would be really helpful to engage more with you about that. Personally speaking, I don't have I don't move in policy circles, and I don't move in carbon credit arenas. And so I'd love to get your insights into that, and perhaps even try and make some links between representation at community levels where I've been working and these much larger scale global events. Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds like a really good invitation to have you back for another conversation. We have colleagues obviously working on the politics of carbon, the financialization of nature here in our resource politics group at IDS. And I know a couple of them are keen to chat with you after the seminar as well. So it sounds like we're going to not just celebrate a really fantastic start to the conversation, but continue to develop it in new directions over the year between now and COP30 and hopefully beyond. So I'd just like to thank you a great deal, Luke, for bringing a really fantastically provocative and inspiring set of reflections to us, grounded, building on years of experience, many voices speaking through you and through your amazing research team, and fantastic to have you with us. So I'm going to ask for a round of applause for Luke, but also for Evan for sharing insightful and challenging reflections, to everyone who's asked some really great questions today, Kieran for making it all possible on the technical front. Thank you, Kieran. And just a reminder that if you're interested in other seminars in this series, and indeed to other more informal debate spaces at this important time in Brazil's relationship with the world, drop our colleague Lucia a line. Lucia Nade here at IDS is convening the Sussex Brazil group. Write to her, get on the mailing list, stay tuned, and join us for future conversations. So thank you very much indeed, Luke, and all. Thank you.